risk for type 2 diabetes. That's not news. And what I would like to propose, though, is something further, that there is enough evidence to support the fact that we could, in fact, call meat eating a risk factor for type 2 diabetes. Now, the subtleties between those two statements might be lost on most people, so I want to go over how we came to the conclusion that meat should be considered a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, and how important that is and what that might mean for the health of many Americans who end up with this disease. So the American Diabetes Association has a list of risk factors that they have published in their Standards of Medical Care. They publish this every year. And the risk factors are for people, adults, who are overweight, whose BMI is 25 or greater. So, while meat is associated with diabetes risk, it has yet to be defined as a risk factor for type 2 diabetes. So, my co-speakers, co-presenters here today, Carolyn Trapp and Dr. Barnard, and I published a paper called, appropriately, Meat Consumption as a Risk Factor for Type 2 Diabetes, because we wanted to look at all the studies that looked at populations and how they judged these risk factors, just as they looked at all the studies that showed being sedentary might be a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, or being related to first-degree relative with type 2 diabetes. So, we looked at different studies that measured meat consumption differently. One way you can do this is categorically. You do or you don't eat meat, yes or no question, pretty simple, and that's a great way to look at populations to see where their risk for diabetes lies. Or maybe it's gradations of meat consumption. You eat a little bit, you eat a lot, and you compare and see where that risk is. Or dietary patterns. So this is a little bit different than a scalar variable. By this we mean, do you eat a heavy animal protein diet with lots of refined carbs, lots of fat, and that would be typically defined as more of a Western dietary pattern? Or do you move towards more whole foods, less fatty foods, fewer animal products, and see where the risk lies within those dietary patterns? So I might have missed it, did anyone talk about Seventhday Adventists today? They will, because Seventhday Adventists make especially for this question that we're talking about here, which is meat consumption and disease risk, they make a perfect study group because there's four lifestyle tenets that are very relevant to what we're talking about with diet and disease risk. And they are that they're asked to avoid alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, and meat. And most adhere to those first three tenets, but about half adhere to that fourth. So what you have is this perfect study group to see how meat consumption affects different disease risk, and in this case, type 2 diabetes. So today I want to look at, there's many, many studies with Seventhday Adventists. Today I want to look at three very large ones that look at meat specifically and diabetes. The first is the Adventist Mortality Study. Now in 1960, they looked at about 25,000 Seventh-day Adventists, and they found among them who has diabetes and who doesn't have diabetes, and looked at their diet. Yes, you eat meat, or no, you don't eat meat. And what they found, and they broke it out by gender, was that for women who ate meat, they had a 40% increased risk for having diabetes. And for men, it was 80% increased risk for having diabetes. Then what they did was they said, okay, of those 25,000 people who have diabetes, done with you, we're going to follow the people who don't have diabetes for the next 21 years, and they did what is called a follow-up study. So during that 21 years of follow-up, they came back. For those who developed diabetes, there was again a 40% increased risk for women, and this time a 120% increased risk for men. And a couple other caveats they found within that group was the prevalence of this diabetes increased with the frequency of meat consumption. So meat consumption here is defined as consuming at least 1 serving of meat per week. That's not in our culture that much, but that qualifies you and that puts you in this increased risk. But if you consume more, your risk goes up. Now, fish in this study was not commonly consumed, so they didn't break out fish to see what the risk was specifically with that, but we're going to talk a little bit more about fish later. So that was the Adventist mortality study. The cheerier name for the next study is the Adventist health study. So in this study, they looked at about 34,000 Adventists, and at baseline, again, they just look at the baseline there was a 93% increased risk for meat eating among women and a 97% increased risk for meat eating among men. Again, they said, okay, we see that data, that baseline data, and they took the people who didn't have diabetes at baseline and followed them for 17 years, grouped them together, and found that for those people there was a 29% increased risk for developing diabetes if they ate meat compared with those who didn't. Now again, fish was not commonly consumed in this particular group at this time. However, they did consider it in isolation and did find a slight associated increased risk for diabetes for people who consume fish. Another interesting data point is that they found in this study was that the longer you have been eating meat, the higher your risk. In this case, there was a 74% increased risk for long-term meat eaters versus maybe people who had been eating meat for just a couple of years. So it does compound over the years. The third Adventist study that we're going to look at is the Adventist Health Study 2. They looked at about 61,000 Adventists and found that there's twice the risk for meat eaters compared to people who do not consume meat. And again, this is the baseline data. And you can see here in a graph, the green bar shows the meat eaters, the non-meat eaters or the lacto-ovo vegetarians. We're not looking at the blue bar, even though there does seem to be a more protective effect for getting all animal products out of the diet. Just looking at meat, you had about twice the risk as a meat eater compared with non-meat eaters. This is a more recent study, so we only have 2 years of follow-up. But it's found, again, similarly, that if you consume, if you're vegetarian, you had a 38% reduced risk for developing diabetes compared with the meat eaters. So those are our big yes-no, categorical. Yes or no, you eat meat, you don't. And you can see that consistently at baseline and at follow-up, there is a risk. But the next area we're going to look at is scalar and dietary patterns. So this is a really great, huge, almost 500,000 people in this meta-analysis done by Harvard, looking at Harvard's own huge studies, and it found that, and again, they broke out meat eating in the quintiles in this study, so this is not a yes or no question. This is how much meat do you eat, and is it in this lowest category, or do you fall into this higher category, the highest category, and where your risk lies. And what they found that even for just 1 3.5-ounce serving of red meat, your risk for diabetes increases 19%. And a 50-gram serving of processed meat, your risk goes up 51%. Now, 50 grams of processed meat is the size of a typical hot dog, a traditional sized hot dog, so not very much. And what they also found in this meta-analysis, and there were 2 previous meta-analyses looking at the same kind of data, is that this risk compounds. So while you may get a risk with 1 serving, it doesn't you just don't fall in that category and always be at 19% risk. Every serving you have compounds and increases that risk. So the Nurses Health Study 1, Nurses Health Study is a study looking at women, and it's done by Harvard. I suppose at the time, maybe nurses were all women, I'm not sure, but they've stuck to the protocol. And they looked at 70,000 about women who followed either a Western dietary pattern or what they call a prudent dietary pattern. And the Western dietary pattern is defined as having higher intakes of red meat, processed meat, fatty foods, fatty desserts, fried foods, and refined grains, whereas a prudent pattern would have more whole grains, beans, fruits, and vegetables. And within the Western dietary pattern, they found you had a 49% increased risk for developing diabetes. This was a 14-year follow-up, compared with those who consumed the least amount of those foods that I described, the red meats, the processed meats, the high-fat foods, the sweets, the desserts. But interestingly, when you isolate out the meat products, there's an independent risk. So even the pattern is bad, but even if you pull out the data that just looked at the desserts and the sweets and the sugar and the refined carbohydrates, you get a 26% increased risk for the red meat consumption and a 38% increased risk for the processed meat consumption per serving. So there is an independent risk factor within that pattern. The Nurses' Health Study 2 looked at over 90,000 women, and it was also looking at Western dietary patterns, and what it found is if you consume a serving of processed meat a day or 5 over the course of the week, or however you choose to consume those 5 servings in a week, you get a 91% increased risk for developing diabetes. And adjusting for those other products in the Western dietary pattern does not attenuate that risk. You're still at high risk just with the processed meat. Red meat also showed a risk if you have 5 servings over the course of the week, you're increasing your risk by 59%. So this study came out more recently. In fact, it came out after we published our study in Nutrients. But what I like about this data is not so much what it found, because I'm not really surprised by this information anymore. It just keeps coming in. However, the point is, it does just keep coming in. There's no research out there showing that this is changing. I think Dr. Barnard spoke earlier about the confluence of information, and it just compounds on top of each other over and over again. And there can't be a week or 2 where a new study doesn't come out. And of course, as we're constantly publishing studies at Physicians Committee or doing our own research or publishing literature, as you can find on the tables out there, there's always new information, and it's always the same data, but making the case even stronger. So this study I put in because I thought it was interesting. It's the EPIC study, and if you're not familiar with the EPIC trials, the European Perspective Investigation into Cancer and Nutrition Studies, they look at the European population. In this case, they're looking at 8 countries across Europe. And they too, like with the Seventhday Adventists, look at patterns, not just patterns, but even categorical. So you can be a meat eater all the way down, to vegan, and see how that affects your disease risk. So in this particular study that came out a week or 2 ago, they looked at animal protein. It's a little different than just meat, but the people who ate the most were at 22% more likely or at higher risk for developing type 2 diabetes. With, again, that compounding factor, every additional 10 grams of protein, animal protein, made that risk go up by 6%. So, in conclusion of patterns and scalar studies about meat consumption, what we find is, yes, as your Western dietary eating habits increase or continue, so does your risk for disease, especially in this case type 2 diabetes. But even when you isolate out certain products from that pattern, such as red processed meat, the risk is still there. So back to this question about fish. We heard from one of the Seventhday Adventist study that when they did look at fish consumption, there was a slight increase for developing type 2 diabetes. But I wanted to find a couple of studies that talk about fish specifically. And the Nurses' Health Study 1 and 2 and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, all 3 of those being from Harvard, found that when you do isolate out fish and you consume it over 5 servings over the course of the week, you do have a 22% increased risk for developing diabetes, and this was in a 14 to 18-year follow-up study, compared with someone who might consume fish less than once a month. And I want to say that whoever came up with the marketing campaign to to say that fish isn't meat, and that we even have to go through isolating out fish because somehow it magically is not harmful or possibly even helpful for something like type 2 diabetes isn't quite accurate. Fish is meat. Fish is a very fatty meat, and it doesn't come any surprise to me that it might aggravate your risk for something like type 2 diabetes. But these studies did look, and this is another one that looked at 20,000 people. This is the EPIC study again. Remember, these are the studies that look at European countries. And again, it found that fish consumption is associated with diabetes risk. So why would this be happening? Why would meat exacerbate diabetes risk or prevalence or even the condition once you have it? And there are several theories. I'm going to go over 6 of them, although I'm sure there are more. And we looked in our study, we looked at body weight, visceral fat, intracellular lipids, iron, nitrates, inflammation, and how any one of these, or more likely, the synergistic effect of multiple mechanisms might lead to diabetes. I'm going to start with body weight. Observational studies like the Seventhday Adventist or like the EPIC study show that people who consume meat are heavier than people who don't. Again, those are the population studies. If you just look at a population of people, look at their diets, take their weights, people who consume meat are heavier than people who do not. And possibly because it's a higher fat diet. If you're consuming more meat, meat is very high in fat, especially saturated fat, whether you're talking about compared to plant foods, whether you're talking about beef, chicken, fish, it's going to have a lot more fat than your plant foods. And fat has 9 calories per gram, whereas a carb has 4 calories per gram. So you're already packing in more than twice the calories when you consume a fatty food over a more nutrient-dense food, a plant food. It's also displacing that fat fiber, possibly. So if you're not consuming those plant foods, then you're not consuming fiber. And fiber, although a carbohydrate, has 0 digestible calories. So it makes a lot of sense if that's what you're eating mostly, you're going to probably weigh less. You're also going to feel fuller and eat less and weigh less. So you're eating a lot more nutrient-dense, high-fiber foods when you're on a plant-based diet. And then there's the theory around just animal protein somehow leads to weight gain. Maybe because insulin resistance is aggravated by certain amino acids found in those animal products and meat products. And then maybe the saturated fatty acids, which are primarily found in animal products, increase the insulin response, which reduces fat oxidation. These are just theories. And these are theories that were done with the Chicago Western Electrical Study, where they found that when they looked at almost 2,000 men in Chicago, that somehow, even when you control for calories and other components, physical activity, other components in the diet and lifestyle, something about the animal protein seems to make people weigh more. A theory. Visceral fat. So eliminating fat in your diet may reduce the amount of visceral fat in your body, which would help improve the function of insulin. And there have been studies to show that when a diet eliminates meat, it reduces the amount of visceral fat in your body, which makes your, when your visceral fat goes up, your insulin resistance goes up as well. So maybe that's why consuming meat is so risky for type 2 diabetes. Then there's the theory that intracellular fat or intramyocellular lipids, IMCL, aggravates insulin resistance. So these yellow fat globules in the cell that got there because you ate fat in your diet doesn't mean you necessarily look heavy. This is on the inside of your muscle cells. It's gumming up a couple of different important functions. It's preventing the mitochondria, which in this case is pictured as those little black sesame seeds, from burning energy. It's also gumming up the ability for your insulin receptors to open up the cell, for the insulin to open up the cell and let that glucose in. So the fat is keeping the insulin out, and it's keeping the glucose out as well. Now, that sounds terrible, but I always find this image and this theory to be the most uplifting, because this is the heart of the solution for diabetes that we found in our studies, where if you can just get the fat out of these cells, and you do that by getting these animal products out of your diet, everything will work. You can consume fruits and beans and starches, because you should be consuming fruits and beans and starches if you have diabetes or anyone else, because they're the healthiest foods on the planet. But the key is to get that insulin that you do have functioning properly. And avoiding animal products does decrease the amount of intracellular lipid in your cells. So iron is often considered a culprit in diseases like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes is no exception, because iron oxidizes. And just like it oxidized in that photo of a railroad bolt or whatever that is, that happens in your body. And it will damage your tissues, including the tissues found in your pancreas, which may be why iron could exacerbate the risk for type 2 diabetes. Iron is independently associated with insulin resistance as well. Reductions in your iron intake are associated with increased sensitivity. We do know from that large meta-analysis I mentioned before of about 500,000 people that there is a strong association between red meat consumption and heme iron levels in your body as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, nitrates, we might ask ourselves, we see there's a risk with meat consumption. You can isolate out red meat, poultry, fish, and processed meat in every time, I believe. Processed meat is always far worse in terms of the risk for almost any disease, and type 2 diabetes is no exception. Well, why would that be? Processed meat, like red meat and poultry, has heme iron, it has fat. What is it that makes it so much worse? And nobody really knows, but one theory is that it's oftentimes preserved with nitrates. And nitrates when you eat them, they turn into nitrosamines, which is a carcinogen, which may be why it's so much riskier with processed meat products. And in fact, the American Institute for Cancer Research, their advice with processed meat products is don't eat them at all. There's no safe amount to consume because they are that risky. And diabetes seems to show just as much risk with more processed meat consumption as well. Inflammation, I find this subject to be a little newer, so there's not as much research on it. But if you look maybe in the past 5 years or so, meat-based diets are positively associated with biomarkers of inflammation, such as C-reactive protein, while plant-based are inversely associated. So this may be why meat is such a high risk factor for type 2 diabetes. It could be inflammation, biomarkers of inflammation. So let's say you can see that there, as a practicing healthcare professional, yeah, there seems to be some risk with meat consumption. I mean, that's not even the debate. The debate isn't that there's a risk. We know there's a risk. But is it enough, such as they've deemed with physical inactivity, such they've deemed with having a low HDL, or with having a first-degree relative with type 2 diabetes? Is it risky enough that you should be screening your patients as meat eaters versus non-meat eaters, or heavy meat eaters versus lighter meat eaters? And if so, are you willing, forget what the ADA might decide, are you willing to make it a checkbox? Do you eat meat or not? And if you do, I think you need to be screened for diabetes and possibly given advice about preventing diabetes. If you go that far, you're probably, maybe you have questions, but your patients will certainly have questions. So I just want to address a few of those about nutrients. There's going to be a million questions about nutrients, but some of the common ones include these four: protein, B12, iron, and omega-3. So we're going to go over those. Starting with protein, where do you get your protein? And there are 20 amino acids in proteins. that our body needs. 9 you can't make inside your body, so you have to consume them. But it is easy. It's too easy to meet your protein needs without meat, said the giant vegan horse running through the field. This is not a nutrient that is difficult to get in your diet. Most of us, regardless of your diet, are probably eating about twice as much as we need. And the need, as designated by the government, is set pretty high. So we're more than twice there. Now the issue your patients might ask, or you might ask, is, well, but the amino acid variation within plant foods, am I going to get all the 9 amino acids I need? Yes, they're all in there. Every plant food has all the amino acids, just in different varying amounts. But what's so lovely is that what's low in one might be high in another. So the traditional pairing of, say, beans and grains has grains which are low in lysine, the beans are high in lysine. Grains are high in methionine, beans are low in methionine. So they make this, not absent of, mind you, just lower. So they make a great complement to each other. However, complementing proteins is debunked. It's not something you need to consciously or actively do. You will get all your amino acids if you have rice for breakfast, beans the next day for dinner. If you're eating a varied diet, you'll get all your amino acids in there. You don't have to eat them together. And just so, in case you don't believe me, protein is in everything. Beans obviously are powerhouses for protein. Bean derivatives like tofu, soy milk, but grains, and even really refined grains like semolina white pasta, a serving of white pasta has 8 grams of protein, just one serving. So it's very difficult, even if you have the blandest diet, to not get enough protein. Broccoli, so all your vegetables are also rich powerhouses for protein. Broccoli, 1/3 of broccoli's calories come from protein. Broccoli doesn't have that many calories, but 1/3 of it is protein, and there's trace amounts of good fats and then some carbs. But for the most part, all of your foods are going to have protein, be great protein sources. Now, vitamin B12, cobalamin, is something that is produced by microorganisms like bacteria. We don't synthesize this. We as plants and animals don't synthesize B12. Bacteria make it, microorganisms make it. We make it in our lower intestines, too low to absorb, so we excrete it. Perhaps traditionally we were able to get B12 through a fairly non-hygienic diet. Times have changed, I'm thankful for that. So we have to get it other ways. Now needs are small, 2.4 micrograms a day, but your ability to absorb this, regardless of where you're getting it, as you age, diminishes. We just don't have the young guts that were so good at absorbing it before. So anyone, our government tells us, over the age of 50 must supplement B12. This is how I greet people on the street. Hello, do you take a B12 supplement? Because it's really important. And I can't believe how many people, including my own family members, who never heard that, my doctor never told me. People in their 60s, 70s, and 80s are not taking B12 supplements, and I can't believe it, but yet we're really worried about protein. So anyone over the age of 50, and I would argue anyone getting close to the age of 50, should be taking a B12 supplement. And the only reliable source after this age is a supplement. And you can do that through supplemented foods, like cereals and plant milks, nutritional yeast, things like that have B12 supplemented in them. You just have to be consistent with your intake. You don't want to mess around with it, which is why I usually say, just get the pill, get the supplement. If you eat a plant-based diet, it is the only supplement that you have to take, no matter your age. And you might need some other supplement because of some medical condition, but this is the only one I know you need to take if you're on a plant-based diet. Where are you going to get your iron? Well, iron is only lost through bleeding, first of all. and trace amounts other ways. So you don't want to be supplementing with iron unless a healthcare professional has told you you have a condition proven by a lab that says you need to be supplementing with iron. Surprisingly, people who don't eat meat consume more iron than people who do. Vegans consume more iron than vegetarians, who consume more iron than meat eaters, and that's surprising to some people. So source is not the problem. You're getting plenty of iron in your diet as someone who avoids meat. It's a different kind of iron. It's non-heme iron. And non-heme iron is a very sensitive iron. And by that, I mean a few things. One thing is, if you have enough iron stored in your body, non-heme iron takes a pass. You don't need me. It just goes, it excretes itself. But if you consume heme iron and you have enough stored in your body, tough luck. It's going to absorb anyway. So non-heme is much more sensitive to what your body's needs are, whereas heme does not. Take that into consideration. However, that means non-heme iron is also sensitive to other things. It's sensitive to being blocked by other nutrients in your diet, including things like fiber, which of course is very helpful, but it can block out some iron absorption. Sensitive to enhancers too. I'm sure you've all heard, or maybe you just know, there's a tradition of putting vinegar on collard greens or spinach, because that makes the iron and other nutrients more absorbable. And although we consume, as vegetarians and vegans, more iron than non-meat eaters, we don't store as much, because remember, it's very sensitive to this issue. And I would argue, based on that previously shown railroad bolt, you don't want to have a lot of stored iron in your body, because it is so closely linked, not just to diabetes, but heart disease and cancer as well. But even though we don't store as much, we don't manifest anemia anymore than meat eaters do. Iron is, we're a very iron-abundant earth, so it's going to be in pretty much anything that comes out of the ground. You don't need to worry about that too much. And if someone is anemic, and you know that because you saw their labs and they just want to avoid taking iron supplements, there are tricks, again, those enhancers to absorbing iron, and then foods that are just very concentrated sources of iron, like blackstrap molasses, for example, which you can add to baked goods.